Hello everybody, so in this week's lecture we will be looking at local government structures and how these have changed from the major years until today, and what are the changes that we are likely to see going forward. Now, I think if there's one thing that you take away from this week, it is how local government is structured today. Okay, if last week's lecture was its historical introduction, think of this as a bit of a continuation of that. Okay, if you don't know how local government was structured in 1993, by and large that's not going to massively affect you, but it's good to know where we've come from and how the arguments have played out, because actually in many cases the history of UK local government has been the same arguments playing out again and again. So it's worth knowing the history and the consequences of those reforms. Okay, so by the end of this lecture you will have an understanding of the broad structures of local government in England, and the reason we're focusing on England in this lecture is because the systems in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland are much simpler. They have unitary authorities. That's it, right? That's done. That was done under Major, or at least in Scotland and Wales, done under Major, and have stayed pretty much the same, and now they're under the review of the devolved administration. So this lecture will focus on England. And then also you'll be aware of how and why local government structures are developing the way they are, the arguments that are used to underpin them, and how there is a general consensus around these arguments. Okay, so we'll look at structural reforms under Major, New Labour and the Conservatives, the role of executive mayors and how they're different from Lord Mayors and combined authority mayors or metro mayors, the role of devolution deals, the difference between local government and local governance, and everybody's favourite, parish councils. Before we start, some people will learn better through looking at maps rather than having things described to them. So there's a link in the slide notes for this section where you can just play around with a map of England which shows each different type of local authority, and I've put them on the slide here. So the first one are your county councils, which contain non-metropolitan district councils, the red line within the grey shaded areas. And then we have metropolitan district councils and London boroughs on the same map, although legally they are different types of bodies, and then unitary authorities. Now, by and large, your metropolitan district councils, your London boroughs and your unitary authorities look the same and have very similar powers. They are, however, different legal entities that are underpinned by different pieces of legislation. So to that end, while you can in an essay treat them all as one, it is worth noting these distinctions, and that might be the type of detail that allows for a higher mark, right? Because you show a greater awareness of the context, the legal context of local authorities. Okay, so even though they look similar and by and large can be considered similar, almost the same, they are not legally, they are different. And we also have combined authorities that have grown, obviously, since 2015. They are covering a greater number of areas, and one of the Conservative promises in the 2019 manifesto was, as they say, full devolution across the whole of England. Now, there's two clear ways that could play out. One is that every area of the UK, or of England, is covered by a combined authority, possibly with a metro mayor. And so that might look like, lots of different county councils perhaps being banded together into one combined authority, or it could mean that county councils also get the same powers that are given to combined authorities. Now, as it stands, county councils can join combined authorities, that is legal, but it's typically not common. And in fact, combined authorities typically exist where county councils don't. And in many ways, you might ask, why not just bring back the old metropolitan county councils that Thatcher abolished? Who knows? I don't. So, structural reforms under the Major government. Now, as Chandler notes, John Major began his political career as a councillor in the London Borough of Lambeth, but he appears to have been at best indifferent to local government as an institution. Although he was obviously aware of the issues around local government, because it was essentially a local government issue that brought down Thatcher. The poll tax was about how to fund local government, and Major had enough on his plate. So he basically tasked his Secretaries of State for the Environment, first Michael Heseltine, then Michael Howard, and then someone else whose name escapes me, to deal with the issues, right? Now, the kind of key piece of legislation under the major government was the Local Government Act 1992. Now, this created the Local Government Commission for England, which could be ordered by the Secretary of State to undertake structural reviews in specified areas and recommend the creation of unitary authorities in two-tier areas. Now, importantly, there was no mechanism for reversing the move to a unitary authority, for unitary authorities to rejoin county councils, nor was there an expectation that the current metropolitan districts, which were essentially unitary authorities already, would be able to create a county council, right? That the move was one directional towards unitary authorities, whereas in Scotland and Wales, the major government just forced through unitary authorities. There was much greater pushback, especially amongst conservative areas. And so Michael Heseltine's original plan to bring in unitary authorities across the country was rowed back by Michael Howard, his successor, who made it more of a process that would take time and that county councils could object to. Now, the logic underpinning the move to unitary authorities was one of efficiency. For the major government, efficiency was basically a byword for larger. Larger local government units were more efficient because they covered more people and you were getting economies of scale. And this would bring lower costs to what became council taxpayers. But as Wilson and Game note, many people liked the idea of unitary government far more when asked were opposed to the Commission's detailed plans for their own counties and to the likely upheaval and cost. In many counties, the weight of opinion favoured towards the status quo, i.e. a two-tier system. So what you get is that people, in theory, in general, like a two-tier, like a unitary system for the simplicity, but in their own areas, they like having a local council, and in a county council, it might reflect more of a kind of identity. And you get that balance between, or at least they say, is like, getting that balance between efficiency on the county level and democratic closeness on the district level. And so the reforms didn't really set out to win hearts and minds. In more evidence of the tension between efficiency and local government representation, we can look to Scotland and Wales, where obviously, like I said before, these reforms for unitary authorities were forced through. And what this led to was far fewer councillors per person in Scotland and in Wales. And then also Great Britain as a whole has on average the fewest councillors per person in Western Europe. Right? So we can see that this could be seen, at least by critics, as example of a democratic deficit, a lack of representation, and a kind of British obsession with reducing bureaucracy at the expense of representation. And then what happened anyway in Scotland is that some of the areas under these unitary authorities were so large that they had to be broken down anyway into non-elected boards to deliver services. So what you really had were unitary authorities that were in reality like county councils, but with non-elected district councils under them. So the whole thing really was more ideological than it was about efficiency or about how best to deliver services. And there's kind of scant evidence, according to Wilson and Game, that larger organisation size means a higher quality or more efficient service delivery. So different services, they argue, scale up differently. So recycling, for example, it might make sense to have a large area covered by one recycling organisation. It might not for, say, maintenance of public footpaths or whatever. And for Wilson and Game, they argue that different services have different levels of optimal efficiency, and so a U-shape exists for any given service. Essentially, once you get past a certain small size, it's not very efficient. As you increase size, efficiency rises, and then as you carry on past the point of optimal efficiency decreases as you increase in size. And so you get these kind of strange U-shapes, they argue. And the major government reforms did not take this insight from public service management into account. Obviously, New Labour came into office promising devolution to Scotland and Wales and nothing to England apart from regional assemblies. Now, these would be the equivalent of devolved assemblies, but they would have, under Labour's plans, areas that had them would have been forced into a unitary authority beneath them. So no region would be allowed more than one sub-tier unit of local government to avoid accusations of increasing bureaucracy. Now these plans were shelved after the 2004 referendum in the northeast of England on a northeast regional assembly. After that was defeated massively, as shown in the table on the slide. And so Labour government stopped with that, went away, thought, and came back with the 2006 white paper, which essentially argued that councils should come and put forward ideas for merging into unitary councils, because again they were seen as the optimal way of running things. And this is despite the fact that two-tier systems occur in all other Western European countries with populations of over 10 million, right? But for some reason, New Labour thought, like the major governments before them, that in Britain this is a recipe for confusion, duplication and inefficiency. And it should also, according to Wilson and Game anyway, be noted that England's smallest district at the time of the white paper in 2006 had a population of over 25,000, nearly 5 times that of the average municipality elsewhere in the EU, while the average district area was about 10 times that of the average EU municipality. So really, we had this debate going on in the UK, or at least in England, amongst, the major government, the New Labour government, that was so far removed from the reality across Western Europe for other similar size countries, that we kind of artificially restricted what was an acceptable range of policy choices. Anyway, the New Labour conditions for merging were too strict, and very few authorities put themselves forward. And again, we have the issue of a reduced number of councillors in England now, and the white paper didn't really explain, and neither did ministers, how boosting councillors' roles and making what was still a part-time job more appealing to the public would be achieved by cutting councillor numbers by 2/3. Essentially, you're asking people to, give up some time for an allowance to do more work than previously was the case. And so, at least for Wilson and Game anyway, they argue that local democracy came a poor second to trying to get efficiency from public finances. And again, this all ties into this kind of overarching narrative of what do you see the role of local government being? Is it to primarily represent people and their views, or is it to deliver services cheaply and efficiently? Another key reform under New Labour looked at how councils themselves would be run, and basically the executive arrangements therein. So up until now, councils had been using a committee system. You'd have one committee looking at housing, one committee looking at environment, one looking at whatever, and this aimed to move councils from a committee system to an executive model, either a council leader with more power with a cabinet, or ideally a directly elected mayor. Why? Well, because both Major and then New Labour looked to America and American mayors and saw them as a good way of doing local government, but also because they thought that having an individual who headed the council would make the council more accountable to the public, and also having big figures in their area would increase turnout because you'd have more contested elections, and would raise the profile of areas, and would allow for a more focused administration on the council level. Now, typically, there were 3 main options. There was the leader and cabinet executive, which is essentially the parliamentary system. You can think of it as right. The leader is typically the leader of the largest party, or the party with a majority on the council, or who heads a coalition. The second one was a mayor and a cabinet executive, and in that sense, that would be where voters voted for the mayor, and then the mayor would pick councillors to be in his cabinet or her cabinet, although it has typically all been men, I think. And then there was a mayor and council manager executive, which was later repealed 7 years later and wasn't as popular. And then there were alternative arrangements, but only really for smaller local authorities that were small for a particular reason, i.e., they might represent an island community or something like that. And the role of giving executive power. So the committee system was important because it combined executive and legislative functions within each committee. Now, these reforms aimed to break that apart and give a organisation, either the leader in cabinet or the mayor in cabinet, the executive power, and councillors would have more of a backbench MP role, one of oversight and scrutiny. Now, typically this falls apart because, say, somewhere like Liverpool, which went from being overwhelmingly Lib Dem in the New Labour years to overwhelmingly Labour, the majority of backbench MPs are from the executive's own party. So where is that oversight coming from? Because party politics and the party poll loyalty is really strong, and people aren't going to oppose their own party leadership for opposition's sake or for scrutiny's sake, especially if that's how they get a promotion or how they further their career. So, I'm not saying it was a poorly thought out reform, but it wasn't the best way of ensuring scrutiny in local authorities. And in my opinion, a better way would have been a proportional electoral system, because that way, in places where there is a one-party state on the local level, voting reform or something like STV would allow for more parties to be represented, and opposition parties actually have an incentive to oversee the council. Well, that's not what we got. The Localism Act of 2011 under the Coalition made it possible for larger authorities to revert to a committee system of governance, but again, very few councils have done this to my knowledge. And if you look on the next slide, you can see that actually there are very few directly elected mayors when you think of the full total of local authorities in the UK. And in 3 cases, Stoke-on-Trent, Hartlepool and Torby, people have adopted a mayor and then had a referendum to disestablish a mayor and go back to a council leader and committee system. Then we also have the Greater London Authority Act, which established the Greater London Authority and the London Mayor. And again, this was partly aligned with New Labour's desire to see more mayors in big cities, but also because they knew they'd win there, or at least they thought they would. And then Ken Livingstone came, stood as an independent, and it was all very messy. But we can see that Labour tried very hard to devolve power down in England without actually devolving power to England as a whole. It wouldn't treat England as a political unit in and of itself in the way it treats Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. The argument being England is simply too big within the United Kingdom in terms of population. But in trying to dodge the question, or trying to avoid having an English Parliament, say, they just kept tying themselves up in knots. So this image shows the structure of local government in Great Britain anyway, so not Northern Ireland, by the end of the New Labour period. And you can see that compared to now, at least one of the differences is that you can have parish councils in London. But this is kind of the system that we have now as well, although the numbers will be different. Hopefully this image might help you in some way, but don't forget the combined authorities on here. And here, okay, so we have the coalition government. Now, again, Michael Heseltine was brought back to produce a report, and like in the major years, he proposed a fully unitary system of local government for England. Now, the government rejected this, saying it would be expensive during a time of austerity. And what they did instead was push for a series of referenda in big cities to adopt the directly elected mayor. Now, unfortunately for them, most cities said no, they didn't want a mayor, although turnout was low, but generally, all apart from Bristol and Doncaster, and in the case of Doncaster it was about retaining their mayor, said no. Liverpool isn't on the list because the council decided to just have one anyway without the need for a referendum. Now, it would be interesting to see how that went, but obviously we'll never know. But it seems now that we've got one candidate to be Labour mayor who proposes abolishing the mayoral position, as the Lib Dems have always argued as well. So it might be that actually Liverpool is one of the three places that goes back on its decision, even though it never made a decision in the first place, it was made for it. And again, we can see that in 2018, the government reissued proposals on when a unitary council can be created, and it's not really about delivering local democracy or bringing power closer to the people, because it doesn't, right? In abolishing a district council, you are typically going to create a unitary authority that's larger, that covers more people, and so moves politics away. But you can see that the point is on sustainable service delivery and sustainable economic size. Now, nobody says, oh well, actually let's look again at Liechtenstein or Luxembourg because they're not really sustainable sizes, right? It's an idea of priorities yet again, of saying local government has to be sustainable. Well, that sustainability depends on how much you want to charge people, to have local government, and how much central government wants to give. So this is all part of a kind of conservative commitment to austerity and to shrinking the cost of local government, rather than boosting the representativeness of local government. So with the Heseltine report, no stone unturned, we also saw the recommendation of merging funding streams to provide local responsibility for economic development. And this is kind of how the wonk sphere is kind of thinking on this issue. So after the 2015 general election, Osborne said the new powers for cities has to come with citywide elected mayors who work with local councils. And then obviously he went because of Brexit, but that thought continued. So the 2017 Conservative Manifesto argued combined authorities based around cities should have elected mayors, but they will not be supported for rural counties. But then the 2019 Conservative Manifesto goes further and says, actually, we want full devolution across England, building on the successful devolution of powers to city region mayors. Now, they want full devolution across England, but not devolution for England, right? Again, none of this includes having an English Parliament. And so, without an English Parliament, the argument goes, is that you need more layers of local government to kind of make up the difference. Or you can treat Westminster as an English Parliament, but that will only stoke issues with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And so we have this kind of fudge of English votes for English laws within the Westminster Parliament, but that's increasingly complex, and it's essentially a fudge. But either way, we can see that the direction of travel since, the Thatcher era, but since Major and kind of covering this lecture, has been towards bigger and bigger authorities with more powers in relation to kind of strategic powers and economic powers that come both from Westminster but also from the local authorities themselves. So instead of saying, well, actually, we're going to empower parish councils, we're going to empower district councils, the direction has been, well, let's just make combined authorities. Let's cover functional economic regions and things like that. Okay, next up we have the combined authorities and metro mayors. Now, it's important to remember, not all combined authorities have metro mayors, okay? But all metro mayors head up a combined authority. You can look at the different types of devolution deals that have been negotiated by clicking on the link in the slide notes. But I just want to show there's been a lot of them, and it's a constant process. And this is problematic, right, for a range of reasons, because it means that each area has slightly different powers. So it's harder for the citizen to know exactly what their combined authority, their metro mayor, is responsible for. Secondly, by it being a series of negotiations, we know which agent is more powerful. It's Whitehall or Westminster, right? They're the most powerful actors in this. And they lead the discussions, and they lead what is on the table and what isn't. It isn't as if every area can just go, well, Greater Manchester has that power, so we want it for ourselves. There's not a framework in which it's equitable or equal for everyone. No, because it is a conditional contract, it comes with strings attached. And there is also often very little role for individual voters to have a say over the contract, right? It's not put to a referendum of the people. No one was asked in Liverpool, do you want a metro mayor? Do you want a combined authority? No one was asked in Wirral, Hulton, St Helens, Knowsley, Sefton. None of these places were asked. They were just given this from on high because political elites in the region and political elites in Whitehall wanted it. And so it's not a democratic process at all. It's not anti-democratic, right? It works within democratic frameworks, but it doesn't have democratic backing. And even turnout for metro mayors is quite low, considering the power and scope that they have. So I won't go into the nitty-gritty of the deals. You can read this up, and if you're talking about them in your essays for any reason or in your presentations, there are resources here that can help you. As for metro mayors themselves, they have strategic power. Most services are still delivered by constituent councils, and this is different to the type of authority structure used in the Greater London Authority. And so it's worth remembering this when you're writing your essays. London is not a combined authority, and the combined authorities don't look like what they have in London, right? There's no kind of Greater Liverpool Assembly or Merseyside Assembly that we vote for. So metro mayors often, unlike again the London mayor, often have to build consensus and have to get approval, often unanimous approval, on decisions from each of their constituent councils. So it's a more collaborative experience. Now, in some cases, they can be merged with the Police and Crime Commissioner, like in Manchester, but it's not widespread. So in Liverpool, for example, because Halton is part of the combined authority, but part of a different Police and Crime Commissioner area, because it's part of Cheshire Police, Steve Rotherham. And then we have a whole host of other reforms here that, again, you don't need to know the specifics of, but if you are writing an essay on it, or you are you're doing a presentation, then at least you know where you can find this information. Creating a unitary authority is covered by sections 1 to 7 of the Local Government and Public Involvement in Health Act 2007. Section 15 of the Cities and Local Government Devolution Act allows the Secretary of State to disapply some elements of the above act to speed up the process of creating new authorities. And again, we can see that there is a process which is looked upon favourably and which is assumed to be unidirectional, that local authorities will want to leave a county council and become unitary authorities. It is never assumed that unitary authorities might want to become part of a county council for whatever reason. We also see rules that allow unitary authorities to be created that cross the boundaries of existing unitary authorities, which was implicitly prevented in previous ones. So all the pressure is towards this process of creating unitary authorities. And what was even more interesting, I think anyway, is the 2016 Cities and Local Government Devolution Act allowed for only one council to have to say it wants to become a unitary authority for it to take place. So it used to be the case that you needed the county and the district council to agree, but now you only need, you only needed for a series of for a period of time, one one council to agree. And also, the best thing about the Local Government and Public Involvement in Health Act 2007 is that it set out the route for legally creating new parish councils. So this is probably the only reform that we've actually seen which allows individuals to band together to produce a new local level of democracy. Okay, so now we come to the idea of local government versus local governance. And we can see that actually we think of local government as the provider of services, or at least it's viewed within the literature and it's viewed within kind of common discussion as the organisation that provides services. But actually there's loads of different areas in which services are delivered on a local level that are nothing to do with local government. And actually local government is just one actor within a network of different organisations, all of which have to be coordinated. And this is the difference between local government, which is about one body delivering services and providing, governing, and then local governance, which is about manipulating or working within frameworks to deliver outcomes that you believe are desirable. So think of things like joint boards, right, which are legal bodies set up by two or more local authorities to provide statutory required services. Two unitary authorities could band together to empty your bins, right, to repair your roads, to deal with planning applications, for whatever reason, right? They might think, well, actually, we're effectively one area with two councils, let's just do it all. Or they might think they can save money. Or one council might just hire another council to do it. They might look at their own rankings on bincollector.com and go, oh no, we're at the bottom, but our neighbouring council is at the top. It's a lot easier for us to just pay them a lot of money and for them to do the job properly, and we'll get rewarded at the ballot box. We also have joint committees, which are voluntary creative bodies to deliver services more effectively, and in contracting or agency arrangements. So that's where a council might contract out bin services to a private company. So all of these different ways of delivering services kind of challenges the core assumption we make of a local authority being the sole provider of services. And then think of the NHS, right? Healthcare, it is very strange in the UK to have healthcare removed from local government, or at least so far removed from local government. In most other places, there is a role for local government in that type of policy area, but we've completely hived it off to the NHS. So in comparative terms, we have very little democratic oversight of healthcare. And I mean, the British people seem to like that. A lot of love for the NHS, but it's not a democratic institution at all. It's quite a centralised and bureaucratic institution that people have little say over, but whatever. And so, as a result, people like Wilson and Game, for example, argue that all-purpose authorities should be called most purpose because they don't deliver all services in an area, and even then they aren't the only institution that provide government. Instead, they provide governance. We'll cover this in later seminars. But there are downsides to this, right? Fragmentation, confusion, a lack of electoral accountability. If my bins aren't collected or they're collected to a poor standard and I go to complain to my councillor, well, if they're in contract with a private company, there's nothing they can do about it, right? So what is the point of me voting, right? I'm not voting for someone you may as well let the public vote on the contract itself. Okay, parish councils. Now, parish councils can call themselves town councils, community councils, village councils, whatever. They can even be called city councils if they've been granted city status by a royal charter. It doesn't change the powers available to the council. They're often called local councils. So you'd have your county council, your district council, and your local council, or your unitary authority and your local council. But I just think for this module, just call them parish councils. So they were first established back in 1894, and many have continued until today. They were obviously, like as the name suggests, parish. They were part of the Church of England, and the map shows that they are particularly widespread. There are around 10,000 local councils in England, parish councils in England, with over 30% of the country parished, and about 80,000 councillors who serve in these as volunteers, right? Now, there is a process of them being created. You'll see London has 1 or 2 parish councils now. And these are bodies that are underpowered, right? So they have very few formal powers, but they do have what is called the power of general competence. And that is a legal power that was introduced by the Localism Act of 2011. And what it does is it gives councils the power to do anything that individuals can do, provided it is not prohibited to do so by other legislation. So now this applies to most parish councils. You have to the parish council has to choose to adopt the powers. 2/3 of its members have to be elected, and the clerk has to have a relevant qualification. But beyond that, parish councils can have general power of competence. This means they can do anything an individual might do anywhere in the UK or elsewhere. So, your parish council legally can sell things on Etsy. They can do it for a commercial purpose or otherwise, for a charge or without a charge, without the need to demonstrate that it will benefit people. Okay? So, it doesn't have to. They can open, I don't know, your parish council could open a swimming pool in Bangor if it wanted. It doesn't have to show that it would use the money. It could even run it at a loss, right? Politically, that's bad, but legally, it could do it. Now, what they can't do is anything that's illegal, right? They can't trade things or engage in business activity for things that they should be providing by law, right? So Liverpool City Council, for example, can't start selling schooling places, things like that. Charges that they do choose to issue can only be made for services that are discretionary and not ones that have to be provided in statute. And they can't create bylaws or things like that, right, under this power anyway, because that's not what individuals can do. But this does give parish councils a wide range of scope to do a lot of different interesting things. Now, some of the issues around parish councils is that people don't know about them. They're often filled with people like elderly people who have free time, things like that. There are issues, but I think anyway, at least after complaining for so long about how local government has been focused on delivering economic goods and not representing people, parish councils should be competitive, and I think they should be contested, and they should be given more powers as the ultra local body of local government. It is a way of increasing representation. At the moment, as they stand, and as we'll find out next week in powers, they are underpowered, but these things never stay the same.
They're the first tier of government, designed to be the most accessible stage for community discussions and complaints. Parish or town councils are run by elected members of the public, not affiliated with any political party. But interest in community politics is fading. In the 2015 polls, only a fifth of the eligible 10,000 parish and town councils in England contested their vacancies. And this week's election, including Northern Ireland, saw applications to become a parish councillor so low that vacancies left by retiring councillors went unfilled.
Well, I think that's very sad, and I'm very sorry about it. But it does seem to me that the importance of governance in a community has got a lot to do with how well the community feels about itself. And I don't think that politicians spend enough time involving people in the processes of governance. They keep everybody at a distance and again, run these systems that feel quite archaic.
With fewer people prepared to come forward and take responsibility, areas up and down the country have faced empty seats, driving them to appoint unelected volunteers. Princethorpe near Coventry is one parish council that didn't hold elections this week due to a shortage of candidates.
It is a time commitment. Historically, I think they've been seen as talking shops and kind of ineffectual, and that might apply to some of them. But, for example, in my village here, we have important issues. Traffic is one of the key ones, and we have specific issues about traffic. We have no power to do anything about that, but without a parish council to speak on behalf of this village to borough and county, we've got no hope of anything happening.
Over the past decade, parish councils have found themselves taking on more and more responsibilities, including for public toilets, planning, street lighting and libraries. But despite giving more decision power to residents, for many areas it hasn't stirred more interest in local issues. Dorset is one example where some areas they failed to find any candidates at all, instead having to team up with a nearby village to form a parish council. And it does ask the question, why have so many communities lost interest in local politics? With 130 out of 163 parishes in Dorset not having enough candidates, this week saw communities scrambling together for volunteers, eventually finding 436 hopefuls.
I was a parish councillor myself until about 3 years ago. Did it for many years. I think a lot of the public think that parish councillors get paid, and therefore there's a little bit of built-in mistrust and possibly even hate towards them, which is a real shame, because I mean basically without parish councillors you haven't got the sharp end, the front end even perhaps, of the connection between the public and the councils, which are of course populated with people that are getting paid.
And the residents here are less than impressed by the lack of candidates.
You know, my son plays for a football team, and trying to get people to come on, even on the committee for that, is impossible, let alone help for anything else. So, you know, trying to get people to go on the parish council, you've got no hope.
Despite the falling numbers, this week has seen hundreds of new parish councils being created. But for those who haven't elected new representatives, perhaps it's time to look at how to get locals of all ages involved in their communities, before the idea of having a democratic parish or town council disappears for good. Martin Andrews, RTUK, Dorset.
And then finally here is a outline of how new parish councils can be created. The bar isn't particularly high, at 7.5% of the local population needing to sign it. You know, a well-run campaign can get that done easily. And there's also a gatekeeper role from the local authority that needs to carry out what's called a community governance review to see if local councils should be created. But the process does seem to have picked up steam. So since the legislation was brought in, there's been 250 parish councils created, and I think for many councils it's seen as a good way of gauging local or ultra-local opinion, although many councillors could feel like it's somebody trying to step in on their turf. Now, whether that's the case or not depends on local political context, things like that. But the process is there, it is fairly clear, and it's not particularly arduous, which is good if you want to establish some. Okay, here are the group presentation topics and the seminar questions. For group 4, do we have too many local authorities? Well, you might have kind of gauged my opinion from this lecture, but I don't want you to just kind of present to that. I want you to consider, like you would in an essay, the pros and cons of both sides of the argument. I'd also like to point out that the Sanders reading, which it would be great if you could do before the seminar, because otherwise you'll struggle to cover the question. Okay, thank you very much.